After wowing crowds with two great games on the NES, Link was ready to take on the 16-bit generation. Join us in part 2 of the history of Zelda as we look at A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo. On November 21st, 1990, Nintendo released the Super Famicom, known in the US and Australia as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short. The console would feature a 16-bit architecture with a much wider color palette and sound quality to its older NES brother. Nintendo would use the SNES to give all of its major franchises an upgrade in everything from controls to graphics to sound, with its first example being its launch title, Super Mario World. A year later, it will be Link's turn, with The Legend of Zelda, A Link to the Past, and one of the weirdest commercials Nintendo has ever produced.
Zelda の伝説出るついに出るゴージャス今度の冒険リアル君もすぐに体験憎いでやんすねこんちくしょう高画質の謎解きアクション戸惑うことなくのめり込もうもちのロンスーパーファミコン
Released in Japan on November 21st, 1991 as The Legend of Zelda Triforce of the Gods, and released on April 13th the next year in the US as Link to the Past. The name was most likely changed due to Nintendo America's then zero-tolerance policy on religious references in their games. The game's manual and title screen gave us the first backstory on the history of Hyrule. The story goes that three mythical gods, known in the future as Din, Nehru, and Foror, came from the heavens and created Hyrule. Right before they left behind a symbol of their strength, the Triforce. The gods placed this Triforce in a hidden spot in a so-called Golden Land, which would also be known as the Sacred Realm. The game was promoted as being a prequel to the original two games, making it the earliest game in the apparent timeline so far. The story begins with Link being awakened by a voice, Princess Zelda begging for a rescue. Link's uncle heads off for battle, leaving Link behind. Link later finds his uncle gravely wounded, who then hands him his sword and shield before passing away. Dear God, can Link ever have a family without something bad happening to them? As you can see, the game has abandoned the side-scrolling aspect of Zelda 2 and gone back to the overhead perspective of the original game. Controls are seamless. The best thing is that Link can now sword fight in 8 directions, which allows Link to take down multiple enemies at once. And like in the first game, you're able to assign items and weapons now to the Y button. Speaking of weapons, the game also saw the debut of a few new weapons in Link's arsenal. The Pegasus Boots, the Hookshot, the Hammer, and without a doubt the biggest weapon in the game, the Master Sword. This sword will become a staple to the Zelda franchise. The story goes that Ganon has acquired the Triforce and with it has transformed the Sacred Realm into a Dark World. So it's a light Dark World game. The first of many from Nintendo. To save the world, Link is required to rescue the descendants of the 7 sages, who are trapped in dungeons around the Dark World. Like in other light dark games, what happens in one world affects the other one. Dungeons in Link to the Past have also been upgraded, and now feature upstairs and downstairs. It's interesting to be able to see yourself in 2 different areas on the same screen, not to mention falling down certain holes brings you into different rooms. Another element introduced in this game was the ability to get health and money by throwing pots, usually in someone's house. Now imagine if that happened in real life. Hey, don't mind me. Oh boy, a pot! Hey! Where's my money? What? There are a lot of secrets in Link to the Past, the main one being the Chris Houlihan room. Now we all know the story. Chris apparently won a contest in Nintendo Power and got his name in Link to the Past. Now, I haven't found it, but of course the people over at Game Trailers have been able to. Oh, and one more thing. Don't piss off the chickens. I'll never eat KFC again! The game, of course, would be ported many times, being available on the Wii's Virtual Console and the Game Boy Advance with a bonus 4 Swords game, which we'll discuss in a later episode. Link to the Past is still popular and played to this day. Even WWE superstar and boyfriend of Doc Pepper, Cody Rhodes, admits to playing the game yearly. In fact, during the beginning of his wrestling career, he even wore Triforces on his wrestling boots. Not only would Link to the Past be one of the most successful Super Nintendo games out there, the Super Nintendo itself would be a very, very successful console, with it surviving until 2003 before being discontinued in Japan, surviving for almost 13 years. The Legend of Zelda would be the only Zelda game released on the Super Nintendo. What? Oh right! Satellaview! Right! Okay, so if you didn't know, in Japan on the Super Famicom, they had an add-on called the Satellaview, which was basically Nintendo's answer to Sega Channel on the Mega Drive and Genesis. During the Satellaview's life cycle, 4 Zelda games would be released, including 2 versions of a 16-bit remake of the original Zelda, and Link to the Past would also be released. But of course, Satellaview would also host a game called BS Zelda no Densetsu Inishi no Sakaban, which would translate to BS Legend of Zelda Ancient Stone Tablets. The game is basically a remodeling of Link to the Past, and of course, the game was only available on the Satellaview in Japan. So if any of you are holding out for a Virtual Console release, just remember what else Nintendo hasn't put on the Virtual Console yet. For more information on the Satellaview games, I thoroughly recommend you watch Rouge's retrospective on them, or go to bszelda.zeldalegends.net. Well folks, that's all for the history of Zelda this week. Join us next week as we look at...
Nice job, hero!
What was that?
Excuse me, princess.
No. No!